Welcome to the Lubber's Hole, a Patrick O'Brien podcast. You're with Ian.
And with Mike.
As we continue our rereading of those fabulous Aubrey-Maturin novels by author Patrick O'Brien. And after a great time last week talking to our special guest, Antonia Senior, thank you again, Antonia, for all the time that we spent talking about historical fiction. After all of that fun, it's great as well to be back for our 7th episode in our reading of the Mauritius Command. So, Mike, looking back a couple of weeks, where had we got to previously and what's coming up this week?
So popping back over that great interview just before then, we saw administrative stress, human frailty, corruption, and capybara at the Cape, rain-soaked letters, and an unborn porcupine.
Right.
There was the invasion of La Réunion finally took place and brought a not-so-blood-soaked conclusion by Stephen Maturin's quiet, deadly intelligence work. Now, this time, I think we have to ask ourselves, this is a big one. We're surging ahead. Are we going to see yet another victory? Could it be bloodless again due to this intelligence work? Well, actually, and spoiler alert, if you want to skip about 15 seconds, you can, but not even that much. We're going to witness one of the most devastating, catastrophic reversals in the entire Aubrey-Maturin canon. We're stepping right into O'Brien's fictionalized, and we'll talk about it at the end, maybe lightly, very, very lightly fictionalized account of the Battle of Grand Port, which historically was the only major French naval victory of the Napoleonic Wars. Wow. So for one of our characters in this story, however, in particular, it's going to be a life-changing event. Now, here's the quiz for 5 extra points. Can you guess which character that might be?
Clue, it's not Barrett Bondon.
Right. Not Barrett Bondon.
He escapes unscathed from this one. I don't mind telling you. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So, Mike, you're right. Almost at the peak of the action, you could say, for this book. The chapter opens with a council of war. Governor Farquhar, as he is now, governor of La Réunion, in his splendid uniform, sitting at the head of a table, trying to push the military commanders around the table to join him and Jack Aubrey, who feels the same way, in deciding to strike at Mauritius immediately. And it looks like he's carrying the room with him, right?
Yeah, he's making a very compelling case. He's arguing that the British currently have a superiority in frigates, which may not last. Troops who are flushed with victory. They've got excellent intelligence, thanks to Stephen. And what I love here is Farquhar's, sort of rhetorical flourishes to overcome the Army's cautious desire to plan and make sure we don't have mortars without mortar shells at the right time. He echoes the Commodore's words that time and tide wait for no man. I had to read that twice in the book because I thought, Farquhar said that? That's a Jack Aubrey, tagline. He says, as the Commodore says. But he also reminds them that fortune is bald behind. And certainly we all appreciate that. No, or do we? What?
Well, besides sort of sliding into the O'Brien vein of kind of posterior humor that we've had all the way through these books, besides Fortune and her bald behind, we get this really classic exchange now between Jack and Stephen. Jack completely misses the classical illusion, which we're coming to in a moment. And he turns to Stephen and says, Does Fortune have the mange? He's thinking, is this some kind of, skin disease? And it's a really delightful moment. Stephen doesn't mock him. He just calmly translates the old tag and explains that Fortune, the goddess Fortune, if you like, must be seized by the forelock because once she's passed, there's no hair left on the back of her head to grab onto. So, Mike, I'm going to make an attempt at the Latin here, and then maybe we can talk about where it comes from. Ren tibi quam noces aptam dimitere noli, fronte capillata, post est occasio calva. So, you're the man on the scene with the translation here, Mike. What's that mean for us?
Oh, well, the translation is, let nothing pass which will advantage you. Hairy in front, occasions bald behind. So that, that right timing, this perfect occasion is bald behind, but hairy in front. Got to seize it now or it's gone. Yeah. You found this, though. You found one of the earliest references to this. besides Greek and Roman mythology, right?
And like lots of O'Brien sayings, it's got Roman Latin poetry at its heart, but it's also misunderstood and misattributed. So there's a chance for you to play a little bit of one-upmanship with your dinner party guests if they happen to mention, oh, wasn't that Cato the Elder? You can get them here. This is from a book of poems and sayings called Distica de Moribus, Sayings on Morals, which was a collection of proverbs and sayings in Latin in a 2-line format, kind of couplets, with a leaning towards lessons of morality. It was a very popular Latin textbook in the Middle Ages, presumably giving this mix of moral guidance for students and also effective practice in their Latin grammar and Latin construction. The author was once assumed to be the historian Cato the Elder, but you can one-up your dinner party guests by knowing that it was later affirmed to be by another Cato, an otherwise unknown author called Dionysius Cato. So there you go. Fortune's hairy forelock to be tugged.
Right. And Ian, I love that it's a small interaction. It's just a little thing that O'Brien plucks in here, but it shows this easy, unpretentious dynamic of Jack and Stephen's friendship. Jack is never afraid to ask Stephen, or at other times just to provide a large and needed opportunity for Stephen to interpret the intellectual world for him. Right. And Stephen does so without condescension.
Right. And these two good friends are walking through the streets here in Cape Town. Jack's laying out his strategy, and we get some ominous foreshadowing. We've got all kinds of foreshadowing in this chapter and in this book, to be honest, when you look for it. But right here, Jack is explaining that as long as they can seize this heavily fortified island, the Ile de la Passe, off of Grand Port on the south of Mauritius there, if they can seize that fort, the British can deny the French their best harbour, which is Port Southeast, which is inland from there. And that would establish a safe base for all of the bloodless intelligence operations that Stephen excels at. And the navigation is known to be treacherous, and Stephen even raises this. Stephen, the landlubber, says, oh, I'm not meant to be teaching you your business, but, how about this plan? And Jack has an answer. He says he's going to use the Nereid, commanded by Clonfert, for the assault. Clonfert has the local knowledge. Clonfert has this African pilot. Stephen will be with Clonfert, acting as his political advisor and his sounding board. But Stephen, with that role in mind, asks a rather pointed question. Couldn't Clonfert's recent mishap, capsizing his ship or his boat in the surf off the Rivière des Pluies, couldn't that throw a bit of shade on Clonfert's qualifications to lead this particular action? And Jack's response here is pretty interesting, isn't it, Mike?
Yeah, I think so too. He defends Clonfert's bravery, saying the accident could have happened to anyone. But then he lays out his command structure. So he's taking this into account. Jack explicitly tells Stephen that he's not going to give Clonfert his head at the Ile de la Passe. He says, I do not want him to be coming it the Cochrane. And I love that.
It's loaded with meaning. We've talked already about how Clonfert, the character of Clonfert, has a bit of the bravado and the vanity of Lord Cochrane. He was, as we've said many times before, a brilliantly successful, but rather reckless and independent-minded frigate captain. And that's a very meaning kind of warning for Jack to throw out there. He knows that Clonfert has got this insecure character. He sees his desperation for glory, and saying that he doesn't want Clonfert coming at the Cochrane, he's kind of acknowledging there's a risk here that there could be some wild heroics. Now, to take care of that, Jack has put Captain Pym of the Sirius in overall command of the assault on Mauritius. And he justifies this by saying that while Pym might not be very wise, he's a good sound man. I can almost kind of see Jack kind of jutting his chin and frowning and go, oh, yeah, good man, regular as a clock, he says. And that's not the only little introduction that we get here, right, Mike?
No, it's funny. There's a frigate that's just come in the night before the staunch, and there's a captain, and Jack is telling Stephen about this, Lord Narborough. And Stephen's going, who? Lord Narborough. He says, Garin. Ah, yeah. And we go, oh, Stephen says, right. So not only was he in the wardroom of the Lively at HMS Surprise, but he had a son Midshipman Blakeney, who you'll remember from his appearance in the movie Master and Commander. Oh my gosh, who could forget that, right? Now, there was, Ian, a true family of Narborough baronets, right?
Right. Not the first and not the last mention of baronets in this book. And baronets are going to come back to haunt us a bit in this chapter. There was a family of baronets called the Narboroughs. There was a whole succession of them. They were a naval family, but the last of the Narborough line died in 1707 in a very famous shipwreck, in this disastrous storm that wrecked the fleet of Admiral Sir Cloudesley Shovel, which is a fantastic name for an admiral, but it's a real name. Right. Sir Cloudesley Shovel, who famously wrecked his fleet in bad weather on the rocks off of the Isles of Scilly, southwest of the tip of Cornwall there. Wow. So we've got an interesting bit of naval heritage with this name, Garan. We might have some other names that have a strong echo of the past coming up in a while.
Right. Well, for first-time readers, Jack's trust in Pym sounds like a prudent Commodore-like decision.
Yeah.
But for those of us rereading this series, and for those who know their history, this is a masterclass in tragic foreshadowing. Ian had mentioned all the foreshadowing coming through here, too. Yeah. Now, we know the way O'Brien has set this up, that Pym's lack of initiative and Clonford's desperate, unstable vanity could be pretty explosive combined. We've seen examples of it over and over again in the book. This is, as we've kind of teased early in the intro, this is going to create the greatest British naval disaster of the entire campaign. Right. So, yes, little spoiler there, but don't worry. So, now, Jack, not unlike history, which Ian will talk to us about at the end here, sees the individual flaws in the captains, but he doesn't quite foresee how fatally those flaws will interact when he isn't there personally to supervise them.
Right. And Jack's in very practical mode here. And you can kind of see that that's a safe place for him to go as a Commodore, because trying to wade in and manage minute by minute the emotional interactions between these really ill-assorted bunch of captains, that's proved tricky for him. But things that he can control are planning and logistics and orders. And that's where he's focused right now. Stephen reminds him a little bit of the political reality of what's going on that we know about from Réunion and that we suspect from Mauritius. I might say a bit later on about where they might have got some intelligence about Mauritius.
Yeah.
And Stephen says, well, there's a lot of very subversive work to be done. There's a lot of opportunities here for spreading information. You might even say propaganda. And he cheekily claims, as shown in the invasion of Réunion, that his propaganda broadsheets are just as effective as Jack's round shot. He tells Jack that he almost compared broadsheets to broadsides, but had held back for fear that the terrible pun might offend an embryonic baronet. Oh my God, if my friend poked fun at me for embryonically wanting to be a baronet, I think I'd be offended anyway, at least to the extent that I'm allowed.
Right. Well, Stephen explains that he had been talking to Governor Farquhar earlier, and Farquhar had hinted to Stephen that if Jack pulls off this campaign, he'll likely be rewarded with a baronetcy. And so Stephen asked Jack directly, and this is, again, just exactly how their relationship is, if Jack would like to be a baronet.
Well, Jack gives a response that encapsulates his character and his version of honor. We've talked a lot about Clonford's vision of what it means to be honorable as an officer, as a man. Here's Jack's vision. He says, I wouldn't much care for it. An ancestor of mine actually paid a fine to avoid being made a baronet back in King James's time. He'd much rather, he says, be known as plain Jack Aubrey. He's as proud, he says, as proud as Nebuchadnezzar, the biblical king of Babylon, who was known for great pride and power and idolatry. He's as proud as Nebuchadnezzar of his service rank of captain. And he jokes that if he should ever make it to admiral, he will paint, "Here lives Admiral Aubrey," in huge letters on the side of his house. And interestingly, especially for those of you who know the rules of precedence and baronetcies and stuff, he says, I might think differently if I had a son, but I doubt it. So plant that in the back of your minds for what that might mean for Jack personally. And also recall that being a baronet is a hereditary thing. And a man who's a baronet does naturally pass on the title if he has a son.
Right. Well, it shows a very healthy professional pride, especially when Jack immediately contrasts it with his commander-in-chief. Jack tells Stephen that Admiral Bertie, on the other hand, would give his eye teeth to be a baronet entirely because Mrs. Bertie wants to, quote, as O'Brien writes, wipe her sister's eye. And it kind of highlights the difference, at least in this world, between Jack's genuine devotion to the service and kind of the grasping social climbing ambition of men like Bertie. And the entire sequence, really grounds us in Jack and Stephen's mutual trust here and their openness and sharing before we get plunged into the chaos that awaits at Port Southeast.
Right. And there's chaos coming on a small scale with a bit of comedy added to it as Stephen tries to go aboard the Nereid.
Yes.
Because Stephen's a landlubber and he's never often made a good fist of getting from one boat to a different boat. He's 6 hours late. He's burdened down by his bales of all this subversive propaganda, this agitprop material that he's got printed here. The Nereid's crew, unlike the Baudelaire or the Raisonnable, they don't know his ways. They don't know just how much of a ham-fisted guy he is. They're in a fuming hurry to set sail and to chase after the Iphigenia, which is on its way there. In their rush, they literally drop Stephen Maturin in the gap between the boat and the ship's side. And this looks like a difficult moment for Stephen here.
Yeah, it's brutal. He strikes his head and back on the gunwale, cracks 2 ribs, sinks stunned down through the clear water. And if one of the black men carrying his bales hadn't dived in to fetch him out, he would have drowned right there.
And that would have been the end of the story, right, ladies and gentlemen?
Right. At least it would now be the Aubrey series, not the Aubrey-Maturin series.
Right. And O'Brien does this thing that he often does. We sort of hear the drumbeat of action coming, but he's just dropped in a narrative twist here that could derail the whole thing. The co-hero, Stephen Maturin, is injured and sick, and he can't function. And maybe that means the whole story's over right now. He's got inflammation of the lungs. He's got what these days you'd call secondary drowning. He's pinned to a cot for days as the Nereid makes its way up towards Mauritius. But this accidentally gives us a look at Lord Clonfert's psychology, and it's really fascinating. Whatever you might want to say about Clonfert, we're going to see some of the best sides of his character right here, beginning with his ability to be selfless and caring. He gives up his own sleeping cabin to Stephen, and he slings a hammock in the other part of his cabin, and he spends hours at Stephen's bedside genuinely caring for him. And Mike, this is a side of Clonfert that we haven't dwelt on before.
No, absolutely. Stephen notices, though, and it's just the two of them there. Clonfert's capable of what Stephen calls an almost feminine delicacy. He's quiet. He's not, yammering like he is all the time. He's considerate. He has a gentle, vulnerable side that really, wins Stephen's affection. But the moment that somebody else enters the room, that connection completely vanishes, which is fascinating.
Right. And we see this when Commander Narborough, him formerly known as Garon, when Commander Narborough of the Staunch visits the ship, Clonfert immediately starts this very kind of performative style that he has. He's prancing about. He's monopolizing the conversation by telling stories of his time with Sir Sidney Smith. Half of those stories have got unicorns in them. He acts with this such an aggressive affectation of superiority that Narborough loses patience with him and makes an early excuse and leaves. And Stephen's realizing here that Clonfert's intuition really only works in a tete-a-tete, in a one-on-one. In a group, the insecurity, the social anxiety, you might say, makes him overcompensate. And that's what drives him to play the role of the dashing hero. And in a telltale moment, Clonfert asks Stephen to tell the story of Jack's taking of the Cacafuego. This is a story that Jack and Stephen have both told over and over again. And at the end of the story, Clonfert says, "Well, I honor him for it, upon my word. I should die happy with such a victory behind me." And he's quite sincere, and he's not trying to top it. So one-on-one, he seems like a decent guy, Mike, but what are we going to do about the Clonfert that behaves in a group?
Yeah, and the Clonfert that's still striving, for that glory. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. We know from the rest of the canon that Stephen's a great doctor, horrible patient. And
Yep.
so he and McAdams have been, they have their own dynamic going on. And it turns out that this closeness between Stephen and Clonfert is really causing even more friction with Dr. McAdam. McAdam really resents Stephen's sort of ascendancy, that he's kind of Clonfert's man now. And he resents the pleasure that two take in each other's company. We hear later in the chapter how Clonfert really does not treat McAdam very well. So at this time, they've been arguing over treatment. Really, Stephen's dictating his own course of treatment. McAdam comes into the cabin half drunk, tries again to assert his medical authority over Stephen, and then happens to notice one of Stephen's broadsheets, which had slipped out from under the mattress here. And Stephen is upset inside personally because he's, usually much more careful about this. It's written in Irish. He asks Stephen what it says. Stephen says, "Oh, you don't read Irish." And they get into this big discussion. McAdam assumes it's meant for what he calls those papish or blackguards on Mauritius. And McAdam makes some more derogatory remarks about the Irish and about papists, and says what civilized man would have any idea of speaking Irish or want to speak Irish. And Stephen says, well, it depends on your definition of civilized. And here we nail it with McAdam. I'll give you my idea of a civilized man. It's one that makes crappies lie down, that drinks to King Billy, and that cries the Pope. McAdam starts singing "Crappies Lie Down." So, Ian, is this a general folk tune? What is this "Crappies Lie Down"?
Oh, it's pretty nasty. It's a folk song from the loyalist side of the history of Ireland, dating back to 1798 and the Irish Rebellion, which we've talked about before. It's basically "Crappies Lie Down" means rebels go die. And it's sung basically celebrating the defeat of the Irish rebels, including people like Stephen's childhood friend, Lord Fitzgerald, including all of the other tragic deaths on the side of the Irish rebels. Crappies is a term for people with short hair and people who followed what you might call Enlightenment, French-style, human individual liberty philosophy in Ireland were known as cropheads.
Like those French revolutionaries, so they're sort of patterned on,
Right.
They're fighting right now. Yeah. Wow.
Exactly. So
wow.
It's really not nice. If you've ever been an Irish nationalist, if you're a Catholic, if you speak Irish, if you're a Gaelic speaker, "Crappies Lie Down" does not sound like a quaint folk song to you. It sounds like a hate anthem, really.
Wow. Gangster rap from the 1798s.
Yeah.
Ouch. Ouch. Well, this interaction has an impact on Stephen, and it's coming on top of the heat of being confined to this cabinet, his confinement. He's not allowed to have tobacco, and it's all boiling up. And then against his better nature, and he realizes that he's doing this, he says, "It is the pity of the world, Dr. McAdam, to see a man of your parts obnubilate his mind with the juice of the grape." And Ian, if you would enlighten us on obnubilate and then give us McAdam's response. I thought this was fascinating.
Well, obnubilate is a very, very archaic word for darken or dim, coming from the Latin word for shadows or clouds, I think. And obnubulating your mind means clouding it over by taking mind-altering substances. And McAdam's rejoinder is right there. So he's drunk, but it's not that drunk that he can't engage in some repartee. "It is the pity of the world, Dr. Maturin, to see a man of your parts obnubilate his mind with the juice of the poppy." Mic drop, McAdam out. And there you go. And Stephen writes afterwards in his journal that he's amazed that McAdams has got insight into his opium habit. And we're sitting there looking over Stephen's shoulder going, "Dude, everybody knows that you have the opium habit, except you don't realize." Anyhow, he thinks, in Stephen's own kind of self-denying way, he says, it hasn't dimmed my powers. I'm taking a much lower dose, he writes, than in Diana's day. And he wonders then if McAdam's patients in Belfast showed a disgust for themselves, for their fellows, and for the whole process of living as Stephen does, and wonders if this sense of disgust had incapacitated any of McAdam's patients. And that's very quickly into a very dark reflection in Stephen's mind. His humanity feels like it's drained away. He feels like he's going through the motions. However, even laudanum and even his low mood can't dull the loathing that he has for Napoleon and the disgust and the motivation that creates. So this sounds like depression in the mind of our hero, Stephen Maturin.
Yeah, yeah. Watching him journaling like that and saying, even with all this, I wake up in the morning and it's still right there. I thought, wow.
Yeah.
Like you said, this is a heavy point, but in O'Brien fashion, the tension breaks with this wonderful moment of O'Brien comedy a little bit and some more insight into people here. Stephen, this next morning, though, wakes up having written those entries, but he's feeling relaxed. His fever's gone, and he notices that a midshipman is kind of watching through the crack in the door there and announces that Lord Clonfert would like Stephen to know that there is a mermaid to be seen off the starboard bow.
And part of me is going, mermaid, yeah, right. Unicorn, yeah, okay, I know what we're talking about here. Stephen rushes to the rail, and what he sees is a vast, greyish creature with a round snout holding a huge baby in her flipper. He's absolutely delighted. Stephen identifies it right away as a dugong. The perpetually surly macadam insists that it's just a manatee. But the best part is the crew's reaction to the dugong. They're terrified of the bad luck that comes from a mermaid, and there are two factions on the deck arguing passionately over whether this was a mermaid holding a comb or a glass, because they'd seen this kind of splash of water and they'd seen some kind of a reflection. Stephen doesn't bother to try to put these ignorant people out of the idea that this is a mermaid, but he does wrap it all up by leaning over the rail, takes a look at the dugong and says, "You're all wrong. It's a hairbrush." Completely silences them. Everybody's thoroughly disturbed by the idea that this mermaid might have had a hairbrush.
Yeah, and this is so O'Brien. We've got these two groups that are now facing off, about to do injury to one another over there. No, it's this. No, it's that. And then Stephen says, it's the other one. And like, oh, no. And they kind of walk off. And McAdam had told Stephen, what this is. It's not about the mermaid. It's about this incredible ability for humans to kind of be influenced by each other and their misperceptions, which I thought was interesting. And as part of this interaction and discussion, Stephen's a little concerned about McAdam, and he goes out of his way to kind of be nice to him as he sees him that morning. And then he realizes McAdam has no memory of the conversation the night before. And so Stephen's like, okay, so this is all good. And where it's like, okay, God, all right, here's this funny thing with the crew. Here's this thing about how people can't really kind of see reality sometimes, something that follows through on the chapter here. And Stephen's kind of patched this relationship and is feeling better. So I was like, oh, what a warm moment. But that warm moment doesn't last.
No, we get back to serious strategic reality very quickly. We get to Mauritius, to the approaches to Mauritius, and right away, Clonfert gets what looks like a slap in the face. Captain Pym in the Sirius was ahead of him the whole time, has reached the Ile de la Passe first, and has already taken the fort. And Clonfert feels like he's been robbed of the glory. And a reader new to the story might feel robbed of the action. Like, hey, what's happened to the action?
Right.
Where's the beef? Where's the beef? But they go aboard the Sirius, and there, Captain Pym, who, remember, was put in command and was put in charge of this little expedition by Jack Aubrey. Pym is exhausted, anxious. He's grieving the loss of a young cousin in the battle. And with all of this kind of derangement of himself, he cuts short the congratulations of Captain Clonfert, gives him very curt official orders to garrison the island and to consult with Stephen on all political matters. And basically, he's done. He's going to go back up to the north of the island now. And Stephen can see that this curt offhand treatment from Pym is felt as a deep rebuke by Lord Clonfert. And on the boat ride back to the Nereid, Stephen can see that Clonfert's face is showing it really ugly with resentment. Now, Mike, before we go on, there's one fun little thing I want to mention about the interaction aboard ship between Stephen and Clonfert. This brings us back to baronets as well. Clonfert's steward, who had served Stephen with a drink earlier in the chapter, is a guy called Clarges. And there was a family of, you guessed it, baronets called Baronet Clarges. The Clarges men, who were all politicians and not sailors, that were a line of baronets, the last of whom died in 1834. So They were contemporary with this scene here. And here's the thing that made me kind of lean in and look again at this name. Clarges is the name of a street in London, a real world street, because the Clarges was a real world family. There is a Clarges Street in London. It's just in the St. James area, just opposite the Green Park. Clarges Street in London is where later on in the canon, we're going to hear that Diana lived for a while. If you remember the connection with Louisa Wogan, that whole thing was in Clarges Street. And Clarges Street is 1 block away from Half Moon Street, which, minor spoiler, is where Stephen and Diana are going to have some time together later as a couple. So there's this little name here that's maybe connected with all the reading that O'Brien's done about baronets in the 17th and 18th century, and it's going to stay in our minds for much later in the canon. So, fun little Easter egg for us there.
Oh, that's awesome. Absolutely well spotted. Well, we see how mercurial Clonford's moods are. So, he's ugly with resentment. And then as soon as Pym and the Syria start to sail off, Clonford's mood swings to the opposite extreme. He becomes manic. Left as his own master, he not only is delighted on the rest of the boat ride back to his ship, but when he gets back, he launches this series of aimless, boisterous raids all over the coast.
Right. He is, to use Jack Aubrey's phrase, coming at the Cochrane a little bit here. But even, Cochrane used judgment, and he was interested in the strategic and military impact of the daring things that he did. Clonford seems to be just acting out here. He takes the battery on Pointe du Diable. He blows up the powder magazine. He hosts lavish dinners to celebrate this and other relatively trivial conquests. And Stephen finds this extremely distasteful and notes the curiously vulgar tone that come in the response from all the officers aboard the Nereid. They're all flattering Clonfert. They're comparing him to Lord Cochrane, and Clonfert is just eating it up here. And for all Clonfert's mood is high, it doesn't make us feel nice as readers, right?
Right. And some of that flattery is also comparing him to Commodore Aubrey as a frigate captain, at which Clonfert says, oh, no, because Stephen's sitting there. So it's really, it's a real suck-up culture there. And it's so tragic because Clonfert is so desperate for the worship of these younger, not the kind of men you usually find in a wardrobe. And he allows them. They occasionally invite Dr. McAdam. They ply him with liquor, get him drunk, and then they all make fun of him, and Clonfert lets that go. And it seems to, just be there. He's so completely dependent on their adulation to sustain this fragile ego. But Stephen was not impressed.
He really wasn't. Here's the full quote of Stephen's evaluation of Clonfert at this point. Stephen, says the text, found his boisterous energy wearisome, his appetite for destruction distasteful, and his continual dashing about the country, often in full dress, with his diamond-hilted sword and his foolish star, as tedious as the dinners he gave. And just in case anybody else's brain works the same as mine, I can confirm after some brief researching that the phrase appetite for destruction has no connection to the rock band, the Guns N' Roses, nor is it connected to Robert Williams, who painted in the 1970s a picture called Appetite for Destruction, which was the picture that the band chose for their cover art for their debut album in 1987. Pretty sure Patrick O'Brien wasn't a Robert Williams art aficionado, and I'm darn sure he didn't know about the Guns N' Roses back in 1974. So, alas, just a coincidence of the phrasing here.
Right. Well, as Clonfert is off doing all this, Stephen is going about his intelligence work on shore. And we get this famous dodo bolster scene. He happens to run into this ancient gentlewoman whose grandfather, she said, had eaten a dodo and stuffed a bolster with its feathers. And of course, Stephen is just, if you will, with child to obtain this bolster, to buy it. And so he's met her, he's done these things, he's brought her on board, and he's trying to talk her into selling it to him.
Right. And Clonfert's trying to negotiate. He's being a bit noisy and a bit facetious. This all just confuses the old lady. Fortunately, here comes the plot turn. Stephen is just paying down his last coin and just clutching the precious dodo bolster when the door bursts open and a voice shouts, "Run! Run for the boats! The enemy is in sight." And Mike, with the trap about to spring here, with us perfectly poised on the precipice of a massive battle, with 5 French ships in the offing, the Victor, the Minerve, the Bellon, and 2 captured Indian men, with all of this about to befall, this is a great time for a break.
I'd say so.
Welcome back from the break. We hope that you're having a good time so far. We also hope that you're having a good time engaging with us on our social media channels. We've had some great comments in recent days and weeks from listeners on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/lovershole, who follow us on Facebook and on X and on Blue Sky as well. And especially, we love spending time interacting with our great supporters on Patreon, patreon.com/lovershole. The Patreon supporters are awesome because they help to support the show and make it possible for us to keep it going from week to week. In return, they get the chance to listen to all of our episodes ad-free. They get all of the back catalog ad-free. They get extra juicy tidbits from us. They get insight into what's coming up. They get the chance to help us figure out what we're going to do with our special guests and where we're going with the show. So if you'd like to join us on our Patreon, please head over, choose a tier that suits your needs, and we'd love to have you aboard. Meanwhile, Mike, here we are. The trap, as we said, is about to spring. The enemy is in sight. What kind of situation are we in here?
Yeah, well, what an enemy it is, as you pointed out, this incredible array of ships coming in. And meanwhile, Clonfert and Stephen and a lot of the officers and crew and folks from the fort are all out pulling one of these aimless missions here. So they're in the gig, and a lot of people have not even gotten back to their boats here, but the gig is way out in front of them, pulling desperately against the wind to get back to the Nereid and across 4 miles of the lagoon. And Clonfert looks through his glass and he reads off this massive French squadron bearing down on them. The corvette Victor, the heavy frigate Minerve, the Boulogne, and 2 recently captured Indiamen, the Ceylon and the Wyndham. So, insult to injury. We're all here to stop this. And here yet are another couple of Indiamen who are heavily armed and now in French service.
Now, Clonfert's hubris takes over. And it's funny, Clonfert's remark here reminds me about the tale of the general commanding the U.S. Airborne Forces who were in the Battle of the Bulge. And somebody said, the Germans have got us surrounded, poor bastards. I think they earned that hubris, the 82nd and the 101st. I don't think Clonfert has earned the hubris. He says, this is great. I shall lure them in. Yeah, right. Okay, let's see how this is going to work out. He hoists French colors on the Nereid and on the fort on the Ile de la Passe. Remember, he got a signal book that was captured when Pym's forces had taken the fort. So he's intending to play a Jack Aubrey game with the signals and lure the French fleet inside. And we get to watch this entire sequence through the eyes of Stephen Maturin. It's a brilliant choice by O'Brien. He often seems to be aware that just telling the story of a battle from on the deck of the ship involved in the battle can get repetitious or can get predictable. So he likes giving us new perspectives on a battle. And here we are, Stephen observing from up high, which means, by the way, he gets a great view. He's in a remote corner of the fort. He's sitting on the dodo feather bolster that he is just purchased. And from up there, he gets this glorious perspective, Mike.
Yeah, this is almost, and O'Brien writes it this way, cinematic, this cinematic detached perspective. He sees the beautiful tropical weather. He sees the white trade clouds passing steadily over this pure sky, and even a bosun bird wheeling in perfect curves overhead. So I love how O'Brien paints this kind of serene, natural world in contrast to this frantic confusion down in the fort. And Stephen, watching all this, especially, looking down at the fort, starts feeling this creeping, ill-defined apprehension, as he describes it, like that which accompanies a nightmare. as time seems to stagnate among the panicked men in the fort, but then moves relentlessly out to sea. So it's kind of spreading this malaise across here. I'm like, oh, geez.
And it's super tense, this writing. We all know O'Brien can write action in a very kind of tense, exciting way. He does a really good job with it here. Some of his best action writing, I think, of the whole canon. The French ships form a line and glide into this narrow channel by the Ile de la Passe. They are in dead silence. Leading the way is the corvette, the Victor. She comes around the fort, comes within 20 yards of the Nereide when Clonfert reveals his deception. He drops the French disguise, hoists English colors, unleashes a devastating broadside on the Victor. An officer runs aft on the Victor to say, we've struck. And meanwhile, the fort does the same thing. French colors come down on the fort, British colors go up. And now the Minerve and the Ceylon, coming in behind the Victor, are exposed to the heavy guns of the fort and to the broadside of the Nereide, and they're in a narrow channel. It looks for a few seconds like a daring victory, but then catastrophe. Some cheering fool hauls down the French tricolor and accidentally flings it away to one side, directly onto a tub of burning match near the magazine, and 100 gun charges explode simultaneously, blinding the defenders, killing and injuring dozens of men, dismounting the guns. And now we're in a very different situation here, Mike.
Yeah. Stephen's no longer spectator. He's thrown back into this grim reality of naval surgeon. So in the middle of the shrieks and the clearing smoke, he starts treating these horribly burned men, and the tactical situation completely collapses. In the confusion, the Victor rehoists her colors, cuts her cable, and escapes further into port southeast. And then the Boulogne comes on with terrifying determination. She's throwing a bow wave. She knows this place so well. And O'Brien writes here, he's capturing this terrifying momentum of naval warfare so well. The Boulogne sweeps past, firing her broadsides into the disorganized fort, and then engages the Nereide yardarm to yardarm, almost touching before sailing further into the channel.
Right. And this disaster comes partly from the lack of preparedness, but also from this loss of the fort's offensive power. Clonfert is still detached from reality. He returns to the island later in very high spirits. He puts the fort in order, ready to withstand an attack, and still thinks that this is great. How do you like this, Maturin? We have them in the bag. It's a really astonishing delusion. He even sends a message to Captain Pym, asking for just one frigate to come in and reinforce them, boasting that he, Clonfert, will lead them in and they'll destroy the whole French squadron because they can't get out because they're trapped by the land wind. He's so obsessed with being an Aubrey or a Cochrane type hero that he refuses to acknowledge the danger that he's now in. Now, Stephen suggests that Clonfert should sail off and get Pym and bring more reinforcement, but Clonfert says, no. Pym ordered me to hold the fort. That's what I intend to do. How Cochrane will envy us, he says.
Yeah, he says, I will hold it to the end. I mean, oh my gosh, it's really awful. And this is essentially the lethal payoff to his hubris. It happens when Pym finally arrives days later in this Sirius. And Clonfert, still in this, detached from reality, hoists a signal that says, ready for action, an enemy of inferior force. And O'Brien writes, he does have some presence of mind to say, with a slightly conscious look. It's like, yeah, he's looking at Maturin as he hoists this. It's like, yeah. And this is a fatally misleading signal that draws Pym right into the trap.
Right. Pym trusts Clonfert's local knowledge. He trusts the signal about the inferior forces of the enemy, comes sweeping past the fort under topsails, but enters this tricky inner harbor with its dogleg turns and its shallows, and strikes hard on the tail of a coral bank. Now, they manage to heave the Sirius off the next morning, but that happens only just as the Iphigenie and the Magicienne, the two other British frigates, arrive to join the fight. The disaster is now being compounded. Pym orders all of the ships into the inlet. Clonfert leads the way in the Nereide, navigating this winding channel, but there's intense fire from the French frigates and the shore batteries, and Mike, the fatal blow is about to fall here.
Yeah, it happens again. The Sirius misjudges her swing and grounds on the rocky edge of the channel. The Medicean and the Iphigenia press on, but in the last wind, 400 yards from the French line, the Medicean also takes the ground.
Wow. So
Ah,
we get to this stage here with the Nereid now alone again. All of the reinforcements are aground. She's running down to this sweeping fire. She's going to anchor broadside to broadside alongside this fresh, confident, well-manned, heavier weight of metal French frigate, the Bellon. Meanwhile, her consorts are stuck on the reefs, like we said. His desperate vanity and his misleading signals have led Clonfert to bring the whole British squadron here into a situation that's about to become an absolute slaughter. And Mike, before we get into the final description of how the action plays out, I want to pay tribute once again to the foreshadowing. Here we have 3 ships aground. That tilts the odds completely against Clonfert. And ships running aground, that happens in tricky, shallow waters. We've had foreshadowing for pages and pages and even chapters and chapters in this book. We had Clonfert's escapades in the surf in La Réunion. What was it, 2 chapters ago? We had the dugong, or was it a manatee, that loves shallow water. We got it documented as being a creature that loves shallow water. Stephen's observation to Jack about the plan, noticing that this particular stretch of water was a passage fit for a canoe at high tide. We've had all the references to the rocks and the reefs and the twisting. This has had ships running aground written all over it for quite some time here.
absolutely. Yeah, with all this happening, it's funny. We've had this thing about Clonfert's bravery, and yet almost this manic kind of detached from reality thing. And once again, as we just kind of alluded to, he doesn't hesitate. They had this battle plan on who was going to do what. And the Sirius was going to take the Bellone, but now Clonfert says, "Oh well, I'll have to take the Sirius's place. Lay me right alongside the Bellone." He drops anchor and opens up with his 12-pounders at point blank range. And actually, for a moment, it kind of looks like they might pull this off, which is kind of like, whoa. And I just love the roller coaster of this action.
Right, because even though she's aground, the Magicienne can still bring some of her forward guns to bear. The Iphigenia, from her part, is hammering the Minerve. It's a maelstrom, and Stephen is up on deck, and O'Brien describes the... It's funny. We often talk about O'Brien's use of light and color when he wants to be poetic and get us into the scene. He sometimes also uses the description of sound as well. He says, from Maturin's point of view, there's this huge volume of noise, greater than anything that Stephen has ever experienced. But piercing through even that roar is this all too familiar noise of the cry of the wounded. And there's a real terrible slaughter being done here on the decks of the Nereid. And now things start to shift a little bit as the battle continues.
Yeah, and they shift rapidly. The Salon and the Minerve both cut their cables and drift ashore. The Bellone gets rammed by the passing Salon, and it too goes aground. And you would think 4 grounded French ship means a British victory, but the Bellone grounds perfectly broadside to the Nereid. And because the other British ships are stuck out of range or blocked by shoals, the entire weight of the French ships and the shore batteries turns on Clonfert's frigate.
Yeah, and this is where it gets, you might even say, hard to read. It's really harrowing because this is what happened. This ship took an absolute pounding. A shot cuts through the spring on the Nereid's cable, which was how she was controlling her direction so she could point her guns. She now swings helplessly around. Her stern takes the ground, so she's partly grounded too. She's pointing directly at the enemy, so not broadside on. She's helpless, and the French can pour in this steady, raking fire. The first lieutenant and 3 of the army officers on board are killed. There's blood literally running over the quarterdeck in a sheet. To make matters worse, Dr. McAdam, the Nereid surgeon, has collapsed into an alcoholic coma. And we know what that means for our friend Stephen.
Yeah, it's funny because, all during this thing, Stephen's been up on deck going, well, I've always been in the orlop, but I don't want to leave. I could just stand here like the military officers, just stand here amongst the bullets, kind of do the right thing. But now, like you say, he's got no choice. So he strips off his coat. It takes over the dark lantern lit orlop deck. And because McAdams, Loveloy boy, none of his assistant, they don't have any idea what to do here. And O'Brien's description of Stephen working here is masterful. He's performing amputations, delicate surgeries in the midst of this ship jarring and shaking from the impact of this heavy shot smashing into the hull. And Stephen's thinking through his head that, I've seen at least over half the ship's company passing through my bloody hands now. Of the 281 men, he's thinking there are 150 wounded, 27 dead, and up on deck, maybe 70 killed outright. And it's like, wow. Like you said, it just, it's a slaughter.
It really is. And the slaughter reaches Clonfert. Lord Clonfert comes down to the orlop. We've seen his vanity before. We've seen his desperate need to play the hero, but now he pays the price. He's had this really ghastly splinter wound. One eye is torn out. His maxilla, his jaw, is shattered. His neck is ripped open so deeply that the carotid artery is laid bare and it's pulsing there in the light. It's a really horrific first-person description. Clonfert, who knows what he's feeling right now, but he's fully conscious. And when a messenger arrives from Captain Pym suggesting that Clonfert should abandon ship and come aboard the Sirius, Clonfert refuses. And in this ruined voice, because remember, his throat and his trachea and his carotid are all laid bare, in this ruined voice, he says, "Abandon my men? I'll see him damned first," and tells the messenger to tell Pym that the Nereid has struck. Mike, there's a little telling thing there. Not I'll see myself damned first. I'll see him damned first.
Right.
So he's competing with his fellow naval officers right to the end here.
Yeah. Well, this tragedy drags on through the night and into the next morning, because at dawn, the French resume firing on Clonfert's ship because the colors haven't actually come down. There's a rumor that they've been nailed to the mast and that the halyards have been shot away here. Clonfert actually staggers back up to the quarterdeck. He tells Stephen, I have to see this thing done properly. He sits on a match tub and orders the carpenters to cut the mizzenmast away entirely to properly strike the colors, murmuring, as I say, there, I have done it properly. Man, oh man.
Right. And I hear him say, I have done it properly. He's referring to the striking of colors, but I hear him going, I have conducted myself properly. Like I've finally found this terrible catharsis that allows me to prove that I was a proper guy, a proper seaman, a proper hero.
Good point.
And it's a really bitter end to Clonfert's desperate pursuit of all this glory. Historically, this is an account of what is known in the history books as the Battle of Grand Port. As you said, Mike, earlier on, it remains the only significant French naval victory in the Napoleonic Wars. And objectively, it's a disaster for the Royal Navy. But by the way, it need not have been. As we read in the text, Iphigenia could possibly have warped herself free from the long shoal and stood in and attacked the immobilized French ships. But Pym said, no, we need you to help heave the Sirius off and go on saving our ships that way. Even Stephen and others better qualified than him thought that that plan could still have meant total victory. But as it is, things stay as they are. Nereid has stricken her colors, and it's a defeat.
It was fascinating to me that, again, we're back to these characters and everything, that, when the Iphigenia's captain comes in and goes, look, I've got a plan. We can do this. And Pym says, nope. First order of business is to get my ship out, and he's, I'm the commander. And here's everybody else thinking, wait, if we did that, we could still win this thing. But no. So, Ian, I kept wanting to call you all week and say, so how is this true? Is this true? Oh my God, did this really happen? And, I did a little bit of reading, but I know you are so versed on it. How did this compare to the historical record? How much was O'Brien making up and using here?
It's almost all historically accurate. It's astounding how much of this really happened. Because you think that Battle of Grand Port, defeat Minerve, Bellon, Iphigenia, all of that. Differences were, of course, that the name of the captain of the Nereid was a fellow called Nesbitt Willoughby. We've talked about him before.
Yeah.
Up to this point, we've said he's not exactly the same as Lord Clonfert, but Willoughby alongside the real world Captain Pym, this slightly plodding, slightly dour commander of the Sirius, these two were a really combustible combination. And Willoughby was a bit of a hero type, and faced with this situation, getting beaten to the draw by Pym and the Sirius, he responded exactly as Clonfert did. The expeditions ashore, pointlessly rowing around, taking all these little target locations, that happened exactly. The drama with the French colours coming down on the fort and then catching fire and setting fire to the magazine, all of that happened exactly. Willoughby's signal was the same as Clonfert's. He signaled to Pym, time to attack, enemy diminished in strength. That's exactly what he signaled. Very, very few differences. It turned out that Nesbitt Willoughby, his terrible wound across his windpipe and his carotid artery, he actually already had that wound going into the Battle of Grand Port. Nesbitt Willoughby was a big, physically courageous, larger-than-life character. He incurred all kinds of wounds and disasters and had all this great physical courage. He was using a musket that blew up in his face in the days and weeks before the action. So he actually already had this dressing on his throat that was already in place. That wound didn't happen to him in battle. It had happened to him before. The rest of his wounds, including him losing his eye, including the surgeon saying, look, we're about done here. They've killed or wounded almost all the people. That's exactly according to the record. The butcher's bill, as you might say, what was it? 210 men killed or wounded out of 280. That's true to life as well. Nesbitt Willoughby called this a point of pride. He was proud of the fact that his frigate had sustained more death and injury than any other British frigate in any other action up to this point. Oh, which is very different, right? When you compare that with the almost bloodless taking of La Réunion and all of the benefits of a bloodless coup, as you might say. Wow. One other difference, if I can, is where had some of the intelligence come from about what was going on in Mauritius? Our friend Matthew Flinders, who I mentioned a couple of episodes ago, this British hydrographer, cartographer, who'd been captured and was 5 years imprisoned in Mauritius, had been set free and had made it to Cape Town and had shared with Admiral Bertie intelligence about what the disposition of the French forces and the French defenses were. And it's such an O'Brien-ish thing that I kind of wonder why O'Brien didn't include Flinders in the story, and especially for the role that he played in getting us to this point. But, we had one intelligence hero already, and that's Maturin. We have enough layers and enough characters and enough moving parts already, and maybe Flinders would have been one too many. But anyhow, back to the closing stages of the battle. How's it all looking here, Mike?
Well, I'm going to pause for just a second to say, I just love how O'Brien, is so true to history, and then takes something like that wound and uses it just so beautifully in the story. And, it's going to come back again. It's just, he's just, so yeah, I like O'Brien a lot. Yeah, right. Our listeners don't know how much we love O'Brien. So we're back, like you say, Ian, to the closing stages here. The Magician is badly holed, has 9 feet of water in the hold. So her crew abandons her and sets her on fire, and she blows up, as the book says, in doleful splendor around midnight. And then the next day, the Sirius, after saying, nope, you can't go fight. We can't turn this around. We can't grab all the extra men from some of these grounded ships and go in and give it a thing. She suffers the same fate because they never do get her off the reef. Okay. And the Iphigenia is still free, but trapped in the channel, has this horrible wind and is desperately trying to warp her way out against this wind, while under constant fire from new French shore batteries. So the French have been, reclaiming these things that they'd run around and shot up. And it's clear she's going to have to surrender too.
Right. And Stephen manages to get away in the Iphigenia's launch to carry to Commodore Aubrey the disastrous news of what's happened. Stephen boards the Boadicea after a dark, perilous voyage. Jack Aubrey, bless him, is absolutely thrilled to see his old friend, completely unaware of the catastrophe until Stephen drops the hammer blow. He sits down and says, the attack on Port Southeast has failed. The Nereid is taken, the Sirius and the Magicienne are burnt, and by now the Iphigenia and the Ile de la Passe will almost certainly have surrendered.
This is such a tough moment, and Jack's reaction, I love Jack's reaction. It's that grace of command we've seen him with before. Doesn't panic, And he starts to calculate the new odds. So he's saying, 5 French frigates plus the captured Nereid and Iphigenia against my single ship. Let's see, 7-1. And he looks at Stephen and says, but we have seen longer odds, I believe. I believe that was the closing line of the chapter. I get goosebumps back again. It's like, yes.
It's an ultimate Jack Aubrey moment, isn't it? Like, oh, I've been here before. Everything's fallen apart. The squadron is decimated. His rival captains have all failed spectacularly. Jack Aubrey's spirit is utterly unbroken. And we notice that, and I'm thinking, well, there's a big contrast here with Clonfert. Clonfert is physically and spiritually broken. And one last reflection back to the real-life timeline. Nesbitt Willoughby was physically the worse for wear, but he was not spiritually broken after this action. He dusted himself off and went on to even more wild exploits and even more acts of physical courage. But at this point, Nesbitt Willoughby's timeline is going to diverge radically from Lord Clonfert's timeline. So, Mike, we should ask ourselves now, what's going to finally become of the wounded Lord Clonfert? What can Jack Aubrey do to salvage something from this campaign against the steepening odds? And what about Stephen? What about his bolster of dodo feathers? Mike, what do you say next time, my friend, to a little bit more of this Patrick O'Brian?
Well, that bolster of dodo feathers has me on the edge of my seat. I can only say, with all my heart.